my experience. I mean, wherever I am, I felt like an outsider in America. I felt like an outsider when I came here. Now I live in Rome. I feel like an outsider of a different kind there, and now I'm used to it. I mean, it's just I accept it, and that's okay. It's just shades of one of the authors I mentioned, Mavis Gallant, a wonderful Canadian author who has influenced me very much. She was raised in Montreal, Canada, and then she moved to Paris in her 20s and has remained there all her life. She's now, I think, 90 years old. But she has a wonderful title. One of her stories is called Varieties of Exile. It's either the title of a story or the title of an actual collection. But that phrase, Varieties of Exile, that absolutely encapsulates, I feel, my experience of life on this earth. Because wherever I go, there's some sort of wall, something to look over. The metaphor, if you will, with which the lowland begins, the idea of this club, this place that you can't go into, that's restricted. That fascinates me because it's something that I feel so keenly. I mean, I never tried to climb the wall and go into that club, but my whole life has been a series of attempts, usually unsuccessful, to cross some kind of line and to penetrate a world that is off limits to me. You know, in America, I longed to be American, knowing that I could never be American, but I wanted to because I wanted to be accepted. So I struggled and I couldn't. When I came here, I wanted to be like my cousins. You know, I wanted to go to school with them and have a uniform and the water bottle, and I just wanted to be like them because I was aware that I wasn't like them. You know, so this idea of always having some kind of something cutting you off from the center of activity and always being on the other side of the wall and observing has been my experience of life. But I think that is fundamentally the artist's perspective, no matter who you are and no matter what kind of artist you are. So even if you're
it's his or her predicament.
Yes, and it is, you know, even if you're a writer like Alice Munro, who never left Canada, or Ashapurna Devi, who lived her whole life here and led a very, you know, housebound life, shall we say, with all of her responsibilities, but she maintained it's her outsider's perspective that allows her access inside of her characters. The distance. And without the distance, you can't have her perspective, and without perspective, you can't create something that is, well, I don't think you can create something without perspective.
Listening to you, I was reminded of the title of Edward Said's memoirs, Out of Place, he said.
Yes.
So, perpetually out of place, wherever he was. The inevitable question regarding lowlands. What attracted you to the Maoist or / Naxalite movement to write about it so movingly, in fact?
Thank you. Well, I talked a little bit about this morning, but a bit in Bengali, so I think I'll probably be a little more articulate in English. But in any case, it had a very personal origin. This book. My father's side of the family is from Daliganj, and so as a result, in addition to spending a lot of time at 110 Vivekananda Road in the north, I would also spend a lot of time in Daliganj, in this house where my paternal grandparents lived. And at a certain point, I learned about an execution that had taken place during the crackdown in the early 70s, and it was something that had happened just a stone's throw from the house that that my father was raised in and that I had spent a lot of time in. And I was very haunted by this information. I was very troubled by it. I felt I felt extremely ignorant of the history and the reason for the violence, the counter-violence, the whole cycle that played out during those years. I was aware of Naxalbari in a very loose and vague way as a child, because during the years that the worst of the violence was happening here, I was quite young, but I remember my parents talking about it with their friends in America, trying to sort of piece together what was happening, because it was not something that was really on the radar of the news, of the newspapers. It was something very mysterious and seemed sort of very difficult to know exactly what was happening. But of course it was happening in their cities, so they were very curious and concerned about what was going on. So I remember these conversations in my parents' home or in my parents' friends' home, and they would just be a lot of adults talking about something that I found unsettling somehow. And then, as a teenager, at one point on one of my trips to Calcutta, I hear about this execution, and it had involved a boy hiding in this sort of lowland area in the water, a place that sort of seasonally floods and then becomes a kind of drier area for part of the year. And I just was so struck by some of the details about this particular episode, because I asked my father to explain to me what had happened. And so he gave me a version of it, and he explained that it had happened just before Durga Puja, that the mother of this boy had just come back from doing all of the shopping, and then she came back to the neighborhood, that she came and she saw the neighborhood had been cordoned off, that the paramilitary were there, and that her son had been located and told to come forward, and then he was shot in front of his parents and some other family members, which I gather was a relatively common type of incident at the time. But when I heard the story from my father, I think the reason it had such an emotional impact on me is that, because I could sort of picture it, because I knew the neighborhood and I knew the house, and I didn't know the people, I didn't know the family, I didn't know the victim of this particular evenings. But I was so curious, and I felt so humbled by my own ignorance about what it, I'm very ignorant in general about Indian history, and I always feel very ashamed of that, but I wasn't taught it. I grew up in America, and I learned American history until the very end of my schooling, and then I didn't study history in university, so my knowledge of Indian history remains very, very superficial. And so, but sometimes ignorance is good, because with ignorance comes curiosity, and with ignorance comes a sort of place where you can really begin to look at something fresh and say, well, what was this? And why was this boy killed in the way he was killed, and who was he, and what did he believe in to get him into this situation? So the whole thing I was able to approach in my own way. And I'm not saying that's a particular disadvantage or an advantage, but one can use it to one's advantage, I suppose. Clearly, I'm aware of my limitations in terms of trying to portray a period of history in this city that I really have no connection, I have no connection to that time. I was too young, I was removed, so everything had to come from either from books or from talking to people, or from talking to my relatives, talking to people like you, just to get a sense of, what was happening, how were people feeling, what was going on. And it's not meant to be an accurate portrayal. For me, it was, the book remains always the story of a family. And it's true that the story that affected me is a very violent story. It's a story of a young man being killed in front of his family. So the violence is a component of that. But along with the violence, the image that haunted me most was the confluence of the violence and the family gathered, and how that must have impacted everybody involved. And so it's both a family story. I think fundamentally it's a family story, as most of my stories are, or have been until now. But in this case, the reason it has this particular political historical background is that, I learned about this, and I simply wanted to know why it had happened, and that led me on this journey of trying to educate myself a bit about the period, and understanding a little bit about what had been going on.
Death kind of pervades lowlands, but there are some great moments of redemption, and one of those, and it's remarkable coincidence that you actually mentioned Hardy. There is that bit when you describe the flight of a heron, and the line that came back to me when I was reading it was one of Hardy's poems, Afterwards. Mm-hmm. He was a man who noticed such things. Yeah, that's the last line. He describes very minor changes in nature, what is taking place, and he says, when he's gone, I hope he will be remembered as a man who noticed such things. And that's the line that came back. That flight of that heron. And you have other moments like that woven into your narrative about that bird who lays eggs in the Toleganji Club, knowing how those eggs can survive through the summer. Those bits of nature, how do they, descriptions of nature or observations of nature, where do they come from?
Well, I wrote most of this book. I technically wrote most of it in my house in Brooklyn, in New York, but I think most of it was really imagined, conceived in Cape Cod, which is a very beautiful part of the United States. It's on the ocean. It's like a peninsula, sort of, that on the northeast coast in Massachusetts. It's a place that's very dear to my heart, and the place where I really first began to feel like a writer, and also the place where the lowland was born, because it was during one of my father's, my father came to visit me for a week the year that I lived there, and in the course of that week, I asked him for the first time to describe to me what had happened in his neighborhood in '71. And so it's all kind of bound up with Cape Cod. Anyway, so when I started writing the book, I was going to Cape Cod every summer, and as often as I could, to work in the studio of a painter, renting his house and working in the studio of a painter. I never knew him, but a very beautiful place, and a place that I found a deep connection to. And it's my time in Cape Cod is it's very different from my time in New York, obviously. It's a naturally very beautiful, very pure place. It's on the sea. You're aware of nature all the time. You wake up and the day is sort of controlled, shaped by very basic elements, the color of the sky, whether or not it's windy, if the tide is in or out. These are the things that shape your activities. You know, is the tide in or out? Do we go to this beach or that beach? Is it windy? Is it rainy? Do we stay in and read, or do we go out and take a walk? It's a wonderful place for me and my family, and I think that the more I went there, the more time I spent there, the more appreciative I grew of nature and the power of nature, and the importance of valuing and appreciating nature, because I think the older we get, we realize how temporary everything really is, and how, at least for me, you know, the older I get, the more I'm deeply conscious of how precious life is and how fragile it is, and how we have somebody one day and the next day they're gone, and there's nothing we can do about that. So I think nature for me, which is something I you know, unlike Subhash, who is, you know, from childhood sort of obsessed and fascinated by nature, I wasn't particularly as a child. I mean, I appreciated, you know, a pretty day or when the leaves fell or things like that, but I wasn't passionate about it. But I think my time on the Cape gave me, just opened that up for me a little bit. And I find it very reassuring, my connection to nature now as an adult, because in a way it is the one thing that endures, you know, and outlives us. I mean, literature does too, I like to think. Certain things do, other things do, but nature has a certain, you know, I mean, it has a presence that is, it has a profundity as well. I mean, the sea, the sand, the mountains, whatever it is. I mean, as witness to time, as witness to human lives. And so I think my time there, the fact that I was writing the book there, so many of the scenes in the book I imagined while walking on the sand, along the sea, thinking about the characters. Now, the book isn't set there at all. There's a tiny little scene set there, but the vast majority of the book is set either in another part of America or here. But that led me to think about the nature of